In the merciless barren area, the unforgiving snow falls relentlessly. A sick Mustang horse, frail and trembling, lowers its head, its breath forming susceptible clouds within the icy air. Left on my own within the freezing bloodless, abandoned without wish, it waits, its electricity fading with each passing moment. But even as the entirety seems out of place, a glimmer of humanity emerges. What takes location subsequent will repair your religion in courage and compassion. Stay with us for a tale, an amazing way to leave you breathless and inspired. The wind howled via the desolate plains, wearing with it sharp flakes of snow that stung like needles toward the pores and skin. The as soon as pristine white landscape changed into now a snowfall of swirling frost, and visibility had become reduced to only some toes. In the midst of this merciless storm stood a lone Mustang horse, its chestnut coat dulled by frost and its ribs starkly visible under its skinny, shivering body. The Mustang, nicknamed Ember through the rancher who once owned it, turned into barely status. Each shaky step it took seemed to rate it more energy than it had left. Its head hung low, nostrils flaring with labored breaths that created faint puffs of vapor inside the frigid air. The rope round its neck informed a tale of abandonment, left to the mercy of the typhoon and predators that lurked within the shadows. Hours in advance, a truck had stopped at this aways-flung stretch of land. The driving force, a gruff guy in his past-due 40s, had grumbled as he roughly unloaded the pony from a trailer. "You're more hassle than you are truly worth," he muttered, shoving Ember towards the snowy easy earlier than driving away. The Mustang, too susceptible to combat, sincerely stood and watched the fading rear lighting until they disappeared. As the storm intensified, Ember's legs buckled, and the horse sank to the ground. The snow speedy began to pile around its body, creating a white blanket that threatened to bury it totally. Its ears twitched faintly at the far-flung howl of wolves, a reminder that the storm wasn't the simplest chance. But Ember didn't pass. The as quickly as proud Mustang, regarded for its pace and energy, now regarded resigned to its destiny. Its eyes, glazed over with exhaustion, closed and quick as if to in reality take delivery of the inevitable. Just because the storm reached its pinnacle, faint headlights seemed inside the distance. A truck crawled alongside the icy road, its tires slipping from time to time at the slick ground. Inside, Claire Bennett, a nearby Natural World volunteer, gripped the wheel tightly, her knuckles white with anxiety. She had been riding domestic from a nearby reserve after handing over materials at the same time as the snowstorm hit. The stress modified into treacherous, and Claire knew stopping ought to suggest getting stranded. But some issue stuck her eye, a darkish form slightly seen towards the snow. She slowed the truck, squinting through the frost-blanketed windshield. At first she conceived it became a rock or a fallen tree, but then it moved. Her coronary heart skipped. "It's a horse," she whispered, pulling the truck to a halt. Claire grabbed her thick coat and flashlight in advance, then moving into the typhoon. The freezing wind tore at her face, but she pushed beforehand, her boots crunching through the deep snow. As she approached, the sight of the emaciated Mustang almost broke her coronary heart. "Hey boy," she referred to as lightly, her voice slightly audible over the howling wind. Ember's ears twitched, however the horse didn't raise its head. Claire crouched beside it, shining the flashlight over its frost-included frame. The rope round its neck and the deep scars on its legs informed her the entirety she needed to know. "You've been through hell, have not you?" she murmured, reaching out to touch the pony's neck. Ember flinched barely, however did now not shy away. His body changed into two at risk of withstand. Claire knew time changed into toward her. The hurricane changed into worsening, and leaving the Mustang here meant advantageous dying. But getting a full-grown horse into her truck is probably almost no longer feasible by myself. She scanned the place, her mind racing for an answer. Back at her truck, Claire retrieved a thick blanket and a few emergency oats she saved for wildlife rescues. She draped the blanket over Ember, tucking it securely to provide a few warm temperature. Then she located a handful of oats in the front of him. "Come on, friend, you were given to eat something," she advised. To her comfort, Ember sniffed the oats and took a tentative chew. It wasn't an lousy lot, however it became a start. Claire used the opportunity to assess the horse's state of affairs. "You're dehydrated, starving and freezing," she muttered, her breath seen in the bloodless. She pulled out her phone, hoping for a signal, however the display displayed no carrier. Her best desire turned into to get Ember to safety herself. Claire grabbed a makeshift harness from her truck and looped it spherical the horse. "All right boy, it will harm, but we're given to move." With mild coaxing and each ounce of electricity she had, Claire managed to get Ember to his feet. The horse swayed unsteadily but failed to disintegrate. "That's it," Claire stated, her voice shaking with a combination of alleviation and backbone. "Just a touch." Similarly, the journey again to the truck turned out to be agonizingly sluggish. Claire led Ember grade by grade, protective him from the worst of the wind at the side of her very own body. When they in the end reached the truck, she lengthily installed a ramp from timber planks in the bed and guided the Mustang internal. As she secured Ember, Claire glanced lower back at the hurricane. The wolves' howls regarded nearer now, however they had been no healthy for the roaring engine as she began the truck. "You're secure now," she said, glancing at Ember within the rearview mirror. "I do not know how, but we're going to get you via this." The hurricane raged on as Claire drove cautiously via the icy roads, her truck's tires crunching over the snow-packed floor. In the rearview reflect, she may want to see Ember huddled in the truck bed, his chestnut coat barely seen under the blanket she had wrapped round him. The Mustang's sides heaved with shallow breaths, and Claire's coronary heart clenched at the sight. "You're going to make it," she stated aloud as tons for herself as for the pony. The warmth of the truck's heater started out to thaw her frozen palms, but the sit-down lower back of the scenario lingered in her thoughts. She had no guarantees Ember might continue to exist the night time, however she couldn't go through the idea of leaving him available to die. The pressure felt limitless, the snow falling thick and fast in opposition to the windshield. Claire's cabin became although numerous miles away, and the typhoon confirmed no signs and symptoms of letting up. The wolves' distant howls from in advance replayed in her thoughts, a haunting reminder of what have to have came about if she hadn't stopped. When she finally pulled into the slim driveway of her secluded cabin, treatment washed over her. The small wood shape grew to be nestled between towering pines, its domestic windows glowing faintly from the hearth she had left burning earlier. Claire jumped out of the truck, bracing herself in competition to the biting wind as she moved speedy to Ember. The Mustang didn't stir as she opened the truck bed. His eyes had been half of closed and his frame trembled beneath the blanket. "Come on, pal," Claire murmured, gently tugging at the makeshift harness she had secured round him. "We're now not carried out but..." With a mixture of coaxing, pulling and sheer willpower, she controlled to guide Ember down the ramp. The horse stumbled however did not fall, his legs shaky however sensible. Claire led him to the small barn in the back of her cabin, in which she saved substances for natural international rescues. The vicinity changed into modest, with just sufficient room for a few animals, but it was warmness and dry, a stark assessment to the typhoon outside. Claire Rapid started working getting ready a makeshift stall for Ember. She spread sparkling straw on the floor and stuffed a water bucket from the nearby pump. The barn's single overhead light solid a clean glow over the gap, highlighting Ember's emaciated frame. The Mustang stood motionless, his head hanging low, however his eyes accompanied Claire's every movement. "You've were given a few fight left in you," she said softly, placing a small bucket of heat mash in the front of him. Ember sniffed at the meals hesitantly earlier than taking a careful chunk. Claire exhaled in remedy, it wasn't a bargain however it changed into a begin. She knelt beside him, on foot her hands lightly over his body to check for accidents. His ribs had been starkly seen, his coat skinny and patchy in places. The rope burned spherical his neck and legs cautioned a grim tale of forget and mistreatment. "You've been via hell, have no longer you?" Claire whispered, her voice heavy with emotion. After making sure Ember become as snug as possible, Claire back to the cabin to seize extra components. She brewed a pot of herbal tea, something she regularly used to soothe disturbing animals, and poured a few into a smaller field for Ember. As she stepped lower back into the barn, the typhoon's ferocity seemed to reduce. The howling wind changed through the smooth patter of snow in opposition to the roof. Kneeling beside Ember, she supplied him the first-rate and cozy tea, tipping it gently towards his mouth. The Mustang took a sip, his darkish eyes locking with hers for a fleeting second. Claire felt a connection then, an unstated expertise among human and horse. "You're steady now," she stated. "No one's going to harm you once more." As the hours exceeded, Ember commenced out to show small signs of improvement. His trembling subsided, and he finished the mash Claire had organized. She stayed with the aid of his element, speak me to him in low, soothing tones, sharing reminiscences approximately the animals she had rescued through the years. By the time the typhoon began to wane, Claire felt a careful revel in of hope. Ember had survived the worst of the bloodless, however she knew his battle wasn't over. His body became inclined, and his spirit regarded fragile, however there was a resilience in his eyes that gave her religion. Looking out at the snow-covered landscape, Claire's notion about the person who had abandoned Ember. The anger she felt had become tempered with the resource of dedication. Whoever had left him to die had underestimated the electricity of this Mustang, and the choice of the person who had located him. As the sun rose over the snow-blanketed woodland, its rays painted the panorama in tender colorations of gold and white. The typhoon had exceeded, leaving in the return of a stillness that felt almost sacred. Inside the barn, Ember stirred, his ears flicking on the faint creak of the door as Claire entered. She carried a bucket of sparkling water and each different serving of warmth mash, her breath seen in the crisp morning air. "Good morning, good-looking," she greeted, her voice mild but pleased. Ember lifted his head barely, his dark eyes meeting hers. Though his frame become nevertheless frail, there has been a faint spark of life in his gaze, a glimmer of belief that hadn't been there the night time before. Claire set the bucket down and approached Ember slowly, careful no longer to startle him. She had spent sufficient time spherical animals to apprehend that belief become built in small, planned steps. Kneeling beside him, she placed the bowl of mash inside his reap. "You're looking a little higher these days," she said, looking as Ember sniffed the food earlier than taking a tentative bite. The Mustang's coat became nevertheless stupid and patchy, however his trembling had lessened, and his respiratory turned into steadier. Claire gently ran her arms over his body, checking for any symptoms of deeper accidents. The rope burned spherical, his neck and legs had been raw but starting to scab over. She made a mental examine to easy them all over again later with the antiseptic she'd added from the cabin. As she labored, Claire couldn't assist however wonder at Ember's resilience. "You're more hard than you look," she murmured, scratching lightly within the return of his ear. To her wonder, the Mustang leaned into her touch, a small however tremendous gesture that warmed her coronary heart. Over the following few days a routine began to take form. Claire spent every morning and night time in the barn, feeding and caring for Ember while speaking to him in her calm, steady voice. She shared memories of her adolescence on a farm, the primary horse she'd ever ridden, and the herbal world rescues that had brought her to this some distance off nook of the world. Ember responded in his private manner, his ears perking up at her voice, his frame enjoyable while she turned out to be close to. He started out to consume extra with every passing day, and even though his steps were gradual and unsteady, he made small attempts to transport throughout the stall. One morning, Claire determined it had become time to permit Ember stretch his legs. The barn had an adjoining paddock, enclosed with the useful resource of a sturdy wooden fence. She opened the stall door and led him outside, the crisp air wearing the faint fragrance of pine and melting snow. "Let's see what you have got, massive man," she stated, conserving the lead rope loosely as Ember stepped cautiously into the paddock. His hooves crunched in opposition to the icy floor, and for a second he hesitated, his head turning as though to experiment the open space for threat. But then something extremely good befell. Ember took a soar ahead, then some different, his moves growing bolder with every stride. Claire watched as he started out to trot, his head lifting higher with every step. The sight added tears to her eyes. This changed into the spirit of a survivor, a creature who had persevered inconceivable cruelty but refused to surrender. As the days changed into weeks, Ember's transformation had become extra apparent. His coat regained its shine, his ribs had been less stated, and his as soon as weary eyes sparkled with newfound energy. Claire labored tirelessly to ensure his restoration, consulting with a neighborhood veterinarian who furnished advice on his weight reduction plan and care. Word of Ember's story started out to unfold some of the small network. Neighbors stopped by way of with additives, bags of feed, blankets, even a handmade halter. One aged rancher, Mr. Hayes, brought a weathered leather-based bridle that he stated had belonged to his first horse. "Figured he may like this," he stated gruffly, handing it to Claire. Ember had become a symbol of resilience, no longer handiest for Claire, but for everybody who heard his story. People had been inspired through the Mustang's journey, by the way he had defied the possibilities and decided a second risk. One night time, as Claire stood in the paddock looking Ember graze, she idea approximately the day she had located him. The storm, the desperation in his eyes, the way he had diminished his head as though getting ready for the give-up. It felt like a lifetime in the beyond. "You've come in prolonged way, haven't you?" she said, leaning in opposition to the fence. Ember lifted his head, his ears flicking in her route. Claire smiled. "And we are simply getting started out." As the sun dipped underneath the horizon, casting the wooded vicinity in sunshades of orange and purple, Claire felt a sense of peace she hadn't appeared in years. Ember wasn't just a horse, he was a reminder of the strength of compassion, the energy of the spirit, and the amazing subjects that would seem at the same time as someone refused to surrender. As the snow started out to melt, Giving way to patches of inexperience underneath the timber, Ember's recuperation reached new heights. The Mustang now moved with a self-perception that regarded unthinkable just weeks in advance. His coat had regained its chestnut shine, and his lean body became filling out with proper care and feeding. Claire watched with delight as Ember trotted throughout the paddock, his effective legs kicking up tender tufts of dirt. But with Ember's transformation got here new disturbing situations. Claire knew she couldn't maintain him all the time, as lots as she desired to. Her modest cabin and constrained assets were not enough for a horse with Ember's spirit. He wished location, huge open plains wherein he may also want to run free, wherein he must surely be a Mustang all over again. One night time, as Claire sat on her porch looking the sun dip below the horizon, our acquainted truck pulled into her driveway. It grew to be Mr. Hayes, the elderly rancher who had delivered materials for Ember at some stage in the hurricane. He stepped out of the truck, his weathered face severe however type. "Evening, Claire," he greeted, tipping his hat. "Evening, Mr. Hayes," she replied, motioning for him to enroll in her. The vintage man settled into the chair beside her, his gaze drifting toward the paddock wherein Ember grazed peacefully. "He's searching specific," Hayes said. "Real right. He's a fighter." Claire smiled. "He is?" Hayes nodded, his expression considerate. "You've achieved proper through him. But you already know in addition to I do, he is now not intended to live cooped up in a touch paddock. That's a wild horse through and via." Claire sighed, her coronary heart heavy. "I apprehend," she admitted. I want to make certain he's safe." Hayes leaned ahead, his hands clasped collectively. "There's a reserve some hours from proper right here," he stated. "Big location, masses of land. They take in Mustangs like him, let him roam unfastened, however preserve an eye fixed on him. Might be really worth looking into." The concept stayed with Claire lengthy after Hayes had left. She could not overlook approximately the fact. Ember wanted extra than she should deliver him. The next morning she made the decision to the reserve. The female at the alternative end of the road, a clean-spoken biologist named Linda, listened cautiously as Claire stated Ember's story. "We'd be glad to take him," Linda stated. "We have over 1,000 acres of blanketed land wherein he can live as close to the wild as viable. He'll be stable here." Claire felt a combination of remedy and disappointment. "Thank you," she stated. "I'll convey him as quickly as I can." The day of the journey got here fast. Claire spent the morning loading substances into her truck and getting prepared Ember for the adventure. The Mustang seemed to experience that something became specific. He nickered softly as she located the halter round his head and led him to the trailer. "It's okay, boy," Claire stated, her voice consistent however the lump in her throat. "This is a notable issue." Ember hesitated at the trailer's ramp, his hooves scraping towards the metal. Claire stroked his neck, whispering reassurances till he sooner or later stepped interior. She secured the gate and climbed into the using forces seat, glancing again at him via the rearview mirror. "This is not goodbye," she said quietly. "It's clearly the next chapter." The strength to the reserve changed into long however non-violent. Claire couldn't assist but reflect on the journey that had brought them right here, locating Ember inside the hurricane, nursing him return to health, looking him grow more potent each day. It were one of the most tough and profitable research of her lifestyles. When she arrived at the reserve, Linda modified into waiting at the gate. She changed right into a tall, narrow lady with kind eyes and a calm demeanor. "You have to be Claire," she stated, extending a hand. "And this wanna be Ember?" Claire smiled as she shook Linda's hand. "He's prepared to run," she stated. Linda led them to a big open challenge, surrounded through the use of rolling hills and dotted with small herds of Mustangs. Claire opened the trailer gate, her coronary heart pounding as Ember stepped out onto the smooth grass.